Welcome everyone to the Canadian Ecopsychology Network monthly virtual gathering. Hello, my name is Carol Koziel and I'm the founder of CEN. Today, Thi Diep will do a presentation about poignant landscapes and an ethics of flourishing. Thi is a landscape architect, inactive status, and a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Her research explores the meanings that landscape architects give to nature and landscape experiences and how these views affect their ethics as stewards of the land. The project is framed through the phenomenological lens of poignant experiences and the non-judgmental approach of flourishing ethics. Thank you so much for sharing your time and wisdom with us today, Thi, and the airwaves are yours.
Hey, so thanks for inviting me to this talk. So what I'm gonna do is share my screen to show my PowerPoint. So just some of you were already here earlier before we officially started, and I was just mentioning this is my PhD study. I'm on the last leg, I guess, of the study right now. Just doing my revisions of the draft. And so this is I guess the first time I'm presenting this as a whole, several years of work into 25 minutes. So I'm gonna miss some stuff, I'm sure, but I've tried to be as succinct as what I intend it to be. So actually my official title is Nature, Self, and Being in the World, Revealing a Flourishing Ethics in Landscape Architecture Through Poignant Landscape Experiences. But for the sake of the presentation title, it's to get to the point. It's about poignant landscapes and an ethics of flourishing, but it's really about being in the world as well through landscape architecture. In addition to the Canadian Ecopsychology Network for this talk, I would like to acknowledge sources for funding sources for my research, the Social Sciences and Research Council for the Canadian Graduate Scholarship, the Landscape Architecture Canada Foundation for a research grant, and also the internet sources for the images here. And some of these images were actually used in a survey I used for the research itself. Okay, so for those of you who are not familiar with landscape architecture, I just want to give a very simple background. And essentially, I use landscape architecture as I wouldn't necessarily subject, but as a gateway towards a set of people who relate to landscapes. But the project is really about human beings in general. So you'll kind of get that when I go further. So landscape architecture is a licensed profession in North America and in many other places. So in Canada, we have the stats so far is 2,342 licensed landscape architects. In the United States, there's a lot more, 16,740, and the majority or traditional aspect of landscape architecture is the involvement in the design and building of landscape places. So they may be involved in campus master plans, residential landscapes, streetscapes, corporate or commercial landscapes, conservation, reclamation, historical preservation, stormwater management, transit, therapeutic gardens, and community engagement, etc. So increasingly, landscape architects have been involved in much more social aspects of landscapes. So not just the actual physical landscape itself. And landscape design that aspect of landscapes with the building and the designing of landscapes goes back to ancient gardening practices. The profession itself is usually a credit to Frederick Law Olmsted, who was involved in the design of Central Park in New York. And he was also involved in initiating the US National Park System in the mid-late 1800s. So that point is that it starts with ancient gardening practices, but from the profession since the 1800s is very much associated with social responsibility. And I wanted to start with looking at how landscape architecture relates to ideas of eco-psychology. So usually the idealized version of what landscape architecture involves the three overlapping aspects of ecology, community, and delight, which is Ian Thompson's diagram for overlapping values in landscape architecture. So ideally, landscape architecture is quite comprehensive. And for some of you, or most of you may be familiar with Andy Fisher's eco-psychology triangle: nature, society, and the psyche, and trying to cross boundaries between them. I've rotated the triangle in 120 degrees counterclockwise, and from what I found is it very much matches with the overlapping values in landscape architecture. So I think I would say that landscape architecture ideally inherently has I guess the simple way, like the way that eco-psychology looks at things from a more holistic aspect of how we are as human beings in relationship to the world and to land, to nature. But in reality, because landscape architecture is a profession within the modern world, and capitalism, neoliberalism, and all that stuff has to be embedded in the profession that operates in this world system. So, so there are dimensions of landscape art. Well, because I often use the word idealized in the last slide, is that there are aspects of landscape architecture that does not. Well, I'm trying to be like polite about it, so I'm saying that's I guess landscape architecture can do better. Let's just say. So James Corner, who is the designer for the High Lines in New York. I use this comment quite a bit in which he wrote in the 90s. And he says that contemporary theory and practice have all but lost their metaphysical and mythopoetic dimensions, promoting a landscape architecture of primary prosaic and technical construction. Even though that was decades ago, because the world has become increasingly competitive and STEM focused, that the technical sides and the problem solving aspects of landscape architecture is still prevalent and increasing, but I definitely think that the metaphysical and mythopoetic dimensions are very much lost. So when I talked about what it means, so why my project is really about what it means to be human, is that I think of what the aspects of being human are interconnectedness with the rest of the world. So we start with thinking of human beings as ecological beings, social beings, and spiritual beings. So connected with other life forms in the world, other human beings in the world, and also how we connect within a greater cosmological system. So because of this interconnectedness and I guess the human beings' forgetfulness about our interconnectedness, then there's this sense of placelessness that and anxiety of placelessness that we have, and generally there's this need to find home or find belongingness, and that's where placemaking comes into the picture. And landscape architecture is essentially a placemaking profession. So aspects I think about being human in the world are spirituality and morality. So through spirituality, a person reflects on their role and significance within an existential world structure. And through morality, in which one acknowledges that they are indeed part of a greater system, a person reflects on how their behaviors will affect constructive outcomes for themselves and the rest of the world. So the way I structured my project was to look at these two aspects, how a person reflects on their significance in a bigger cosmological structure, and then how one actually acts upon that. And so the two areas of the framework are poignant landscapes. So how we allow ourselves as human beings to be moved by the world, the interaction between the world, and how landscapes reflect back to us our belongingness in the world. It doesn't come across that way when I talk to people. It's just through my whole research that's the conclusion I have. It's so how you actually get affected by landscapes is the essence of the poignant landscapes, but I've made a narrative out of that, which I'll explain later. And then the idea of flourishing, which is an ethics that recognizes we make autonomous choices in interdependent social and ecological systems. So what we usually consider as ethics or morality is usually something that's very binary and judgmental about good and bad. But this approach to ethics, which is the flourishing, looking at ethics as a flourishing way of being in the world, is non-judgmental and really, it's really just about human beings relating to the world in the best way that they think for them to grow. So Chris Kuhlman, who wrote about feminism in ecological communities, and she uses the term flourishing ethics, says that moral agents can decide how to negotiate the world without hopes of reaching a predetermined necessary state of harmony or static equilibrium or an ultimate state. So flourishing ethics is an ethics without purity. So two historical philosophical ideas that I relate that flourishing ethics to would be Taoism, the way Taoism looks at ethics. So like moving naturally into the world without a particular judgment of what's right and what's wrong, and also Aristotle's idea of fulfillment, eudaimonia. So those are the historical aspects of flourishing. And to look at flourishing, we are always acknowledging that we are part of a system, and it's always an interrelated system. So the quote here is, humans cannot flourish without other humans, ecosystems, and species, and nothing in a biotic community can flourish on its own. Likewise, community, both social and ecological, depend on the existence of other communities. Ethical objects therefore flourish as both social and ecological entities. So the way I went about to look at these two aspects in landscape architecture and trying to apply it to the greater humanity was actually through 3 different data sets. So the first was through landscape architecture organization documents to explore how ethics and the role of landscape architecture is formalized and institutionalized. And then I looked at, I used an online survey to explore what landscapes and experiences landscape architects consider poignant and values they consider important in landscape architecture. And then lastly, I did interviews to explore more personal interpretations of poignant landscape experiences and the meaning of flourishing for landscape architects. And what I think is important for the flourishing is the autonomous decision making. So the way I I looked at who to interview was that I determined that it has to be someone who recognizes that there are chose to not be within the hierarchical institutional structure of not as the landscape architecture, but at least they have some decision making about what they want to do. And essentially, I asked in various forms the two concepts, poignant landscapes and flourishing. So I asked in the surveys and in the interviews, what does poignant landscapes mean to landscape architects? So I asked for examples of what they would consider as poignant landscapes, and then stories from their own experience that they would consider as poignant landscapes. And so the second part, I asked what values these landscape architects would consider as important to a flourishing life as a landscape architect. And then I asked what they considered as good landscape architecture and how well they think the profession is doing in relation to that. So in both these cases, the answers are always subjective, and they're always according to the participants. So they are the ones deciding what they consider as poignant landscapes and what they consider as flourishing. And I take that and put it all together and try to figure out what everybody's talking about. And actually I found I didn't realize this totally until after I did my data collection, that people was all over the place, and including me. And there were times that I was being questioned by my bias, and then there were other times where people wanted to tell me what I wanted to, or they wanted to find out what I wanted to know so that they can tell me. So I realized that I actually needed to do a hermeneutic project, which is to look at interpretations of these ideas. And the reason was that, as Gadamer has said, that the task of hermeneutics has always been to establish agreement where there was none, or where it had been disturbed in some way. So I have this big long narrative, and it's not that long, but it's just that human beings in general, like big generalizations, is that we have a lot of ideas, and I would say that a lot of our problems are because we have too many ideas about how things should be, so we actually don't agree on anything in general as human beings. And the way to find a solution past that is actually to see how we interpret things all differently and find the common ground through disturbance. So where I sorted out the disturbances in the meanings that I came out of the project was in these three categories. And I won't really go into the details of them, because I think I was planning to read the conclusion, a section of my conclusion, which kind of sums it all up nicer than something I could just wing up in my mind right now. So, but basically, I have these thoughts in these disturbances, which are how we see nature is how we see ourselves as human beings. How we see the human world relationship, which I would consider as nature itself, is how we participate in it, and how we see ourselves in our world is how we make choices and relate with others. So I'm just going to read a little bit about what I actually conclude through my dissertation. Okay. Based on the various viewpoints and my own interpretation of the world as a participant in the collective human and landscape architecture consciousness, I provided a narrative of how poignant landscapes and flourishing ethics relate to being in the world. In chapter 2, we start at the roots of landscape's mystery, the meaning of nature. While research participants generally promoted a heterogeneous understanding of landscapes and often intentionally probed at the construct of the meaning of nature, binary concepts of nature and culture were still prevalent in our discourse about landscapes. Understandably, this pattern goes beyond landscape architecture and is a discursive thought pattern of the modern human mind. Instead of seeing nature and culture as opposites, I contrasted participants' comments with literature on the nature of humans to consider the perspective of culture as a component of nature. Nature and culture are two sides of the same coin that tells the story of how humans relate to the world. Making place and finding belongingness in landscapes are contingent on how the story gets told by humans. In chapter 3, I used the etymology of the word poignant to explain that pain and beauty are intricately connected to the feeling of belongingness. In a world full of pain, consciously acknowledged or repressed into the depths of the subconscious, human beings yearn to heal and feel that we belong in this world. Consequently, the most common examples of poignant landscapes are those experienced as awe-inspiring or sublime moments. In these remarkable memories, participants encountered glimpses of a connectedness to a greater world of existence. As such, poignant landscape experiences were usually described with humility and awareness. While I saw experience as moments in time, some participants considered experience as accumulated knowledge or influences from the past. Considering that social conditioning can diversely affect how a person sees the world and subsequently tell an unfavorable story of themselves and the nature-culture dynamic, I argued that experience should be a balanced act of participatory witnessing and reflection in the moment so that pain can be overcome by beauty. Accordingly, some participants found that by being mindful of their day-to-day experiences, they could find poignant landscapes embedded in ordinary circumstances. Poignant landscapes as the signal to finding our existential home is about us allowing ourselves to be moved by the world. In doing so, we are in a reciprocal relationship with the world. As a participant in this relationship, we make choices. In chapter 4, I explored how landscape architects make ethical choices towards their roles as stewards of the land. Using an ethics of flourishing that considers ethics as autonomous choice-making in a world of ecological and social systems, I explored how landscape architects navigate between their own personal ethics and institutional ethics established by the professional body and existing social political structures. Participants saw meaning in their work and developed values to support good landscape architecture from their own sense of responsibility and ability to contribute. However, collectively, the profession of landscape architecture wavers over its identity and worthiness in comparison to allied disciplines, which I would argue limits landscape architecture's unique role as a sacred placemaking profession. In tandem, I wonder about my own ambivalent position within the profession and how identity and name status is no longer a sustaining force for my own life's flourishing. Some participants expressed that landscape architecture is simply a part of a bigger team. In parallel, the world is the common ground where all humanity exists. To make changes, we need to shift paradigms. In chapter 5, I considered how the horizons of landscape architecture could expand beyond based on the themes expressed by the participants. For example, crossing boundaries and exploring liminal spaces in the profession could usher in new ways of thinking. While the suggestion of participants are quote unquote new ways of envisioning the profession of landscape architecture, they share the same arc. That is, encouraging a sense of shared humanity within a comprehensive view of the human plus more than human world. Paradoxically, connecting with nature, being mindful of our environment, and being empathetic to fellow human beings are not new ideas. I would call these, quote, origin, end quote, all ideas that are universal traits for the flourishing of humanity and the rest of the world. Unfortunately, these traits have been deprioritized for much of the world's population as an expense to capitalism and self-preservation. Therefore, going outside the box is simultaneously going back to the basics. Going back to the basics is returning to our roots and taking a, quote, radical stance. Instead of being, quote, radically polarized, we need to be doing the total opposite to radically find the commonality of being in the world. That was my summary. And I wanted to mention that where I ended with radical is because that's a reference to Andy Fisher and his radical eco-psychology, which is actually a disturbance to me because I really didn't like the word radical. But that's where I'm talking about in hermeneutics as being disturbed into the different, I can see now a bigger, how we've used the word and how it's supposed to be used, and that makes it a bigger horizon of perspective. So just some last bit of findings was originally I set off to find a correlation between poignancy and flourishing. but they're really not causational. Instead, they're both dependent on a shared function, and that's the ability for perspectives to expand. Awareness of experiences, reflectivity of past and future circumstances at the current moment, and making choices are important to shifting paradigms. So those who are not fixed on binary or narrow definitions of words, such as the words specific to the research, poignant, flourishing, spirituality, etc., and who embraced various interpretations of words and yet made meaning from their own interpretations, were more motivated and optimistic about their contributions in the world. So some practical recommendations I have that they're specific to landscape architecture, but I think can be applied to any profession or anybody, is on the personal realm, practice awareness, self-development, which is essentially self-love for both the idea of belongingness, so that each one of us can share and initiate into community connection. And then from the institutional side is to start in education. And I think that phenomenology is important to be taught in classrooms, and also a deep discussion about personal ethics, and not the way we see ethics as in we should do this to save the planet, blah, blah, blah. It's that what do you as a person feel is integral to yourself. And that I believe that those things should be taught in school. And then professional organizations could put more emphasis on self-development for belongingness. And as I said, that's really about self-love. And rather than entire focus on professional development where we're just feeding information like a computer, and then also providing support for mental, emotional, spiritual health, especially for mid-career professionals, and not in the way that society is generally looked at as a band-aid solution to personal problems, because I believe that this aspect of our holistic health is what we all need for the world's flourishing. And that's actually the foundation. So I'm going to just end this slideshow with a comment that an interview landscape architect made, and which I really like because it's very straightforward and hopeful. So we were talking about poignant landscapes in landscape architecture, and he says, how could you imagine the opposite? Imagine if there were none. What would you be doing? I can't really imagine I can't imagine landscape architecture without poignant landscapes. Like, what else would we be doing? What else would we really be doing? Making certain things just work, I guess. I guess we'll just be making things work. And that's the end of my presentation.